everyone, welcome back to the Earthdawn Survival Guide, the podcast for all disciplines, paths, players, and game masters, with your questers Josh and Dan. I am Dan.
I am Josh.
And on today's podcast, we will be discussing all things thanatological and galamical for the almost last time, as we talk about the last little bit of the horrors before we get to the named horrors. Yes, we are going to get to those. So if you have any questions for us, please drop us a line at edsgpodcast@gmail.com or call and leave us a voicemail. We've only ever had 3, so you could be number 4.
Yeah.
So anything you want to just dive right into the grim and gritty?
Yeah, let's just dive right in.
All right. Fair. No worries. So we're going to talk today because I found this interesting to go through all of the Game Master's Guide and the Companion, that there were 2 different kinds of horrors, basically a lesser form horror and a greater form horror. So this is that episode today. We're going to lump them all into one big episode, the lesser Bloatform and the greater Bloatform, and so forth and so on.
Yeah. So we're calling them lesser only in the sense to differentiate them from the greater.
Yes.
The lesser versions, and every time I say that, imagine me putting quote marks in the air around that. Because none of these things that we are going to be talking about are lesser. They are all dangerous opponents.
Oh, they're still big, bad nasties.
Yeah. And most of them showed up in first edition.
Mm-hmm.
Either in the original core book or in the first edition horrors source book. The greater versions are powered up variants of those, so bigger numbers, more powers, maybe some slightly different powers, to have them potentially pose a challenge to Warden and Master tier characters, whereas the original versions tend to be more for Journeyman, Upper Journeyman, maybe like low 9th, 10th circle kind of thing. But the idea, again, is to provide some examples, some templates, some framework around which you can look at an existing opponent and then say, oh, here are things that you can do in order to make them different or more powerful, in the similar way that we did with the Nashers and some of the variants of the constructs and whatnot that we've talked about in past episodes.
So our first one, and we're just going to we're going to go alphabetically because it just makes sense.
It's easy.
So yeah, most of, as Josh said, the original ones are mostly can be found in the Game Master's Guide, and all of the greater forms, air quotes, can be found in the Companion. So this is how we're going to jump back and forth between. So if you're driving along in the car, don't follow along in the books. Please park, be safe, so forth. That's how people listen to their podcasts. That's all I know. The first one is the regular Bloatform, and this is more of an overall category of floating things, floating slugs, floating jellyfish-looking stuff, bloated corpses, blah, blah. Most of them have tentacles, hence the jellyfish. Most of them have facial features in odd places, but all of them incur madness, murder, suicide, and guilt thoughts on the victims. Take it away, Josh.
This is kind of the category of horror that you go with if you don't have something more specific in mind.
Yeah.
This is the category that's kind of like anything that doesn't quite fit another type is a Bloatform or can be a Bloatform. Unlike Despair Thoughts, which all have a pretty similar appearance, or unlike Kreeskra, which all have a kind of pretty similar appearance. The Bloatform, it's just a weird, bulbous, unusual, tentacly, whatever.
Yeah. So if you're making up your own.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of true that you can have other types of horrors appear however you want them to. Like, you can stage dress them differently to have them appear different. But really, the case with the Bloatform is this is just your weird alien mind warping kind of thing with tentacles or weird appendages. This is where you really get into the, like, Shoggoth.
Oh, yeah.
To kind of draw a Cthulhu Lovecraftian reference there, where it's just kind of this shapeless, unusual, bizarre mass of whatever. And so they all kind of are just big nasty like to torment things.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
These don't like to actually kill their victims directly. They prefer to instead drive them crazy. Like I said, to madness, murder, suicide. So these could be at the end of your adventure as well, instead of just a pawn in the way to the big bad guy. These are all that we're going to talk about today, still the big bad guys.
Yeah, I mean, a Bloatform is a horror that is very likely to keep a community that is under its sway, to keep them alive, to keep them around to entertain and feed it in a way that some of the other horrors won't necessarily quite the same way. I think a lot of maybe generic horror cults would be ones that would be in service to a Bloatform, although Wormskulls would potentially be another one that would be likely to have that. Yeah, this is in some ways almost like the archetypal generic horror when it comes to this. All of the others feel like they have a more specific mode of hunting or more specific way that they do things, and the Bloatform just in general feels like your raving, destructive force of nastiness.
Okay, because if we haven't described it by now, then sure, it goes in the Bloatform category. Is all I've got. So the greater Bloatforms are greater in this sense. They are more cruel, they are more sly, they are more insidious. But the greater Bloatforms, what makes them special is they don't seek out small communities or towns or villages. These seek out larger places to corrupt and infect, and they aim their sights towards cities. So a large population.
Yeah. The numbers are higher. The standard Bloatform in the GM's guide is kind of rated as an 8th circle challenge, kind of top journeyman, whereas the greater Bloatform is rated out as an 11th circle. The numbers broadly, the attribute steps are a little bit higher in a couple of places for the greater Bloatform. The defense ratings are definitely higher. The death and unconsciousness ratings are actually about the same. And so what really kind of sets the greater Bloatform apart is that it has more powers, and those powers are a little bit higher. But all of the Bloatforms, they have horror mark. They typically have resist pain, which works just like the talent of the same name, where it ignores penalties from wounds. They've got potentially quite a number of spells that they would be able to cast, and the other one is is the corrupt compromise power. And this is a power where upon a marked victim, the Bloatform could suggest a course of action to the victim to kind of manipulate them and to get them to do stuff. And the corrupt compromise power, which allows the horror to sort of try and manipulate their victim's behavior by offering them a course of action in return for which they will provide a bonus of some sort to their victim's abilities. So they might manipulate things to put someone else in danger and then offer to provide some kind of strength or ability to have their victim save that individual. But by accepting that deal, the victim gains corruption points, which makes them gradually fall even more under the sway of this thing. And so kind of manipulates them into a situation where there are no good choices. And then, of course, they have terror, which is a wonderful sort of across-the-board horror power. Terror is similar to the Nethermancer's Frighten ability. It imposes penalties, the difference being that terror doesn't have a duration as such. It's a lot harder for the target of the power to kind of shake off its abilities. And that is something that can really make it more difficult to fight a horror. And then in addition, reasonably tough physical attacks that it can make with tentacles or other warped limbs or anything like that.
So in general, a whole lot of fun.
Yeah. There are some, for the greater Bloatform, there are some additional powers that are possible. Just check them out. Look at them in the book. See some of the abilities that they can do. But basically, the Bloatforms thrive on instilling fear and terror into their victims and like manipulating their victims collectively into making deals that ultimately will not lead to a good end for them.
Yeah, Shadowrun always says never deal with a dragon. We should make up a shirt for Earthdawn. You can't cut a deal with a horror. You just can't. It's not possible. On to the next one in alphabetical order. We're going to talk about the crystal entity. This is one of my favorite ones to I can't say throw at people, as I haven't done that often, but this is an astral horror that comes into the physical plane, inhabits an object, and transforms that object into crystal in every dimension, up, down, left, right, front, back. But it can only use spells, and it happens to have a crystal spike bone attack, but it does all these telepathic little whispers.
Yeah, it does not have the ability to move at all. But what it does do is it marks victims and whispers to them and manipulates, preferably groups, into distrusting each other and betraying each other and feeding off of that. But also, if they get within range, they do have a spell attack that makes sort of crystalline spikes erupt from the victim's body, causing nasty damage and getting even more sustenance off of the pain that causes. The crystal entity can be kind of difficult to deal with in one sense because of the capabilities that it has, but also if you can find where it's hiding, because frequently they do like to kind of hide themselves away and have minions or cultists or servants or whatever that are serving them, it can be difficult to get to them. But if you can get to them and you're kind of tough enough to face up to the spell attacks, the magical assault that it's going to bring upon you, then it'll be painful, but you can generally take it out without a whole lot of difficulty.
Yeah. Because the regular crystal entity, like it's everyday run of the mill, the original crystal entity has to inhabit something about the size of a large chest or trunk or larger. The greater crystal entity can inhabit smaller shapes, so it's more powerful. It can actually fit into smaller things, and it's more colorful. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just clear crystal or glass. It'll look maybe colorful, like rose quartz, things like that. And crystal entity will aim for communities rather than individuals, and the greater crystal entity has more nefarious grand plans.
Yes. Agoastia, the horror that has infected and corrupted the former troll kingdom of Utrecht, is a greater crystal entity. That's how it was kind of statted out when we talked about the Dilkava. Several horror discussion episodes. I think the second
sounds right
construct episode we talked about, the Dilkava are a variant undead troll construct that has been created by Agoastia, who is a crystalline entity that inhabits the former capital of Utrecht.
So, other thoughts on the crystal entity? Because I think these are fun.
The greater crystal entity has a couple of additional abilities. It's got astral interference, so it can make it more difficult for people within the area to cast spells or use astral sensing or whatever. Similar to the wizard talent, I think, that does something similar. But they have, by default, baseline subtraction. As an astral horror, they are not affected at all by astral interference automatically. It's not a separate thing that they need to do, unlike the wizard spell. They can forge constructs, horror marks, resist pain, a bunch of spells, additional powers. The greater crystal entity has spell backlash, which is kind of like riposte for spells. The high circle wizard ability that's similar to that, the glyph of something or other. But spell backlash, where you cast a spell on the greater crystal entity, and it can roll to see if it can reflect the spell back at the caster. And some other like sort of magic warping and twisting abilities. And hardened armor, which makes it a little bit more difficult to take out, which is not the case for the standard crystal entity.
Yeah, because, it's crystal. And there are stats in the book about crystal armor. Certain people can wear.
Where the bloatforms are kind of, rawr, I'm a horror, aren't I terrible and awful, and I'm going to make you do awful things to each other.
Too.
Wah ha 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 ha. The cackling villain archetype. The crystal entities are a bit more subtle, and I mean, and many horrors do this, but the crystal entities especially like to masquerade as friendly spirits or avatars of a passion or things along those lines in order to sort of gain the trust of their victims as they start to eventually twist their perceptions and their minds against their friends and fellow community members.
So onto the Garmek. Gharmek. Garmek. These feed on disgust and revulsion. Yeah. They animate the dead to cause this feeling in their victims, but they lurk in burrows, in tunnels, near graveyards. Because you do. But unlike most horrors, these are kind of cowardly. They don't want to be interfered with, but they have a wormy, reptilian type appearance. Of course, with oozing sores and scabs, but a very bony beak. Kind of a worm with a bony beak. This reminds me of the graboids from Tremors, but that's just me. But then again, a lot of things do. Yeah.
Maybe a little bit of the graboid's appearance, but I also temperamentally...
Oh, yeah.
The image that kind of pops to mind for me a little bit are the Skeksis from the Dark Crystal, in terms of their corrupt decadence. That's the kind of...
It's the personality.
Superficial vibe that I get from them. Not that they have like the arms and whatnot, but just in terms of like attitude and personality, that's kind of what I would come across with them as. The Garmek was originally introduced in the Par-Length boxed set as a possible power behind Twiceborn that many of the Garmek that still inhabit the ruins of Par-Length are responsible for the animation of so many of the cadaver men that formed Twiceborn's kingdom. And it is left up to the GM whether the Garmek are actually behind the whole thing and manipulating and controlling Twiceborn, or just find it very convenient to have this very large population of undead to protect them, or whether Twiceborn even has something over them and controls them or whatnot. So the relationship is never clearly defined, but that's where they were introduced as kind of an additional aspect of Twiceborn's kingdom and everything going on there.
Yeah, these just... Oh, they sound nasty.
They don't have a lot of powers. They're physically not that impressive. They're tough to kill in some ways because they burrow into the walls and they protect themselves with their bony skull frill things. But if you can get them pulled out of their burrows, they're pretty easy to kill. But they animate the dead, and so will typically have a lot of cadavermen or ghouls or other undead servitors to protect them and to run interference for them while they perhaps try and slip away if they realize that something more powerful than them is coming into the area.
And the greater Garmek basically is still cowardly, still animates the dead, all the same things, but they just get more creative in their piecemealing of dead bodies when they Frankenstein them together, for lack of a better verb.
Yeah, the greater Garmeks would be the ones that are responsible for some of the more weird amalgamation and more powerful undead constructs that we talked about, like the brutes, as opposed to the standard Garmek, which really just kind of makes your standard cadaver man. And the greater Garmek has greater and wider ranging control and awareness of the undead that they have created to protect themselves even more. They also have tactics as one of their abilities, which means that they have the ability to direct and control their undead servitors in a way that the other Garmeks can't. And they can actually sort of remotely possess undead and to be able to perceive through them and control them directly. And it can use many of its powers through that servitor while they are possessing it.
Yeah, these just, along with the Bloatform, these just kind of come across as if I were to describe to you a typical horror and what it can do, this would kind of be it. Animate some dead, cause fear and revulsion.
Yeah, this is the one that pretty much animates the dead and raises them up to torment the surviving family members and those in mourning and whatnot in order to feast on the sweet, sweet repulsion and disgust that arises from that. A lot of horrors can animate the dead. The Garmek are the specialists at that. That's their bag. That's their thing. That's what they like to do. And a lot of the rituals and practices that developed in the days not long before the Scourge and during the Scourge arose as a result likely of the ability of Garmeks to easily animate the corpses of loved ones, and so dealing with the bodies in that way. These would be sort of the masterminds behind a zombie horde kind of situation.
Yeah, I could see that. On to the Slip Shade. These are, I can't say, they're all fun. Let's just go with that. These are really rare to come across, but incredibly dangerous. They appear as a humanoid shape of absolute shadow, about 4 to 6 feet tall, but themselves do not leave a shadow or have a shadow. They have the ability to shift themselves into flat, nearly two-dimensional shapes that easily slide along floors, walls, ceilings, and the gaps between a door and its frame. Yeah, these are an interesting personality as well, because they, as horrors, have a list of powers Josh will go through in a minute or so, but they also collect works of art. And I mean real works of art, pretty things, not like nasty works of art that, only would attract a horror to them. They actually have an appreciation for beautiful works of art from all the name giver. That's an interesting little wrinkle, I think, for game masters to play with when they want to introduce a Slipshade as the big bad guy at the end.
Yeah. In one sense, it's not really specified as such, but the idea I think that you could work with here is that the treasures and works of art and things like that are collected by the Slipshade would attract adventurers and people looking to recover these valuable pieces, rather than, as you were saying, having like weird twisted stuff that would only attract a horror and would thus kind of repulse or make name givers feel uncomfortable. They have these things in their lair, and so people would go in to try and recover them, and that gives the Slipshade the opportunity to strike out from the shadows, appear in their three-dimensional form, do some attacks, slip back to two-dimensional form, and slip away, and just to kind of strike from ambush and surprise, and just generally feed on the fear and gradual increasing paranoia that comes about as they use the environment to their advantage to just physically wreck those who come into their
and they collect
territory.
The art not just as bait, but they collect the art because they appreciate it, and that's just a weird thing. I know, we're rumors, hearsay.
Look, saying that they appreciate it, it is behavior that is different from many horrors, and thus there are many suspicions about why they might be doing that. The actual reason for which is not clear. These horrors are a little bit more cunning and brutish in some regards, rather than being a more intelligent manipulators, the way that, say, Bloatforms are likely to be, or some others that we'll be talking about soon. Slipshades, the good thing about them is that they tend to be solitary. You're generally not going to be dealing with more than one at a time. The fact that they can shift into a form that is very, very difficult to locate or target for attacks makes them very difficult to fight against. They are fast, sort of tough in their own way. They've got the terror power, so they have the ability to strike fear. There are some things that you can do, like if you've got a magical weapon and you hit well enough, you could potentially like pin the Slipshade in place and prevent it from shifting form and things like that.
Nice.
These things are sort of like the slasher film monster hiding in the shadows of the haunted house, basically being able to strike and injure or kill someone and then to slip away only to come at you again from another direction. The fact that they can shift into a two-dimensional form means that it's very, very difficult to keep them out of places because they could slip under a door or through
a window
cracks or things like that. It is very difficult in some regards to protect yourself from them. This is one that is really good to have in like a limited haunted house type scenario.
Yeah.
Where, you know, you're really kind of building up the tension and having this creature terrorizing the group. This could be especially interesting if you've got a situation where you've got a caravan that the group is guarding, perhaps, then a storm comes up and they need to take shelter in some old ruins or something like that. And so you've got innocent victims that can serve as early things that the Slipshade could go after in order to continue to heighten the fear and whatnot in the situation. So that's kind of what these guys would be ideally used for in that sense, is to really try and go for that classic haunted house or alien type scenario where you are trapped in a location and you need to deal with this very, very difficult and dangerous opponent that can kind of get past a lot of what would otherwise be your normal defenses. Like, you know, barricading yourself in a room might not ultimately protect you at all.
Agreed. You just put yourself into a cage. So the greater...
And of course, the greater Slipshade is just a more powerful...
Yeah, but the greater Slipshade, the only difference personality-wise is they focus on the artists themselves instead of just the works of art. And so instead of collecting sculptures and jewelry and paintings, they want the artists to either corrupt, to influence, to jail and make more art for them. Who knows? But that, you know, do with that what you will. So they really focus on the people behind the artwork. And so that's what makes them greater, per se.
Yeah, one of the things that the greater Slipshade has that the lesser doesn't is they have a blindness power that kind of works in tandem with their terror ability. If they have a victim that is affected by their terror, they can cast blindness on the target, and they have the ability, if they have someone that is affected by their blindness, to cast terror on them.
Yeah.
Sort of as a free action. They have a little bit more of an ability to sneak away and hide. They are a little bit more physically tough. They have the corrupt reality power, which the standard Slipshade does not have.
Mm-hmm.
Corrupt reality is a power that allows the horror to manipulate the environment in order to change the perceptions of those within it, in order to make them see things that aren't there, get them to jump at shadows, so to speak, and whatnot. So, pretty nasty.
They're a different kind of horror.
Yeah, and the greater Slipshade has the unnatural life power, which is a really up-leveled version of Animate Dead. Cadaver Men typically do not get animated with the, if they were an adept, with the powers and abilities and so forth that they had when they were alive. Unnatural life, the target of that, continues to live as normal, but has the ability to use the horror's recovery test in order to heal themselves. And the horror as well can take that life away from them at a moment.
Ooh.
It's something that is offered to people who are terrified of dying, and then it just kind of keeps them alive for as long as they prove useful, because it can, and then kind of goes along with that.
One of my favorite pictures out of the original Horrors book is of the Slipshade, right next to
the Slipshade picture in the original book is very, very
favorites.
stylish, very cool.
One of my favorites. Page 80, in case you're wondering. Love that one. I can't attribute the artist because I don't know who it is off the top of my head, but there you are. On to the next one, because we got like 2 to go. Wing flares. Now, it's called a wing flare. Doesn't actually have any wings. This is a swirling cloud of tiny metallic shards, like a little tiny dust devil. Roughly 6 feet tall, roughly 3 feet wide. Built to harm, because how do you fight air?
Yeah. These things are nasty. certainly the standard version of them, there's not much in the way to indicate how much sapience they have, whether they are instead just kind of more or less acting on instinct. Yeah. But basically, when they're dormant, they could hide very easily in the refuse or trash or whatever that you might find in a standard ruined care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it might just look like a vase is broken, fell off a pedestal, and you walk by.
Right.
When it's in its dormant.
The image that comes to mind for me is like, you think of those classic old cartoons where like somebody pisses off a beehive and the swarm of bees comes out and just like takes shapes and attacks as sort of this sentient mass of death and pain. And that's sort of what a wing flare is in some regards. It's unclear whether it is a single entity or whether a sort of flock of lesser creatures that are all kind of like working in tandem or concert. It was for a long time, according to the tales, unclear whether they actually existed or not, or were simply tall tales told by windlings, which is part of where the name came from, because when they attack windlings, their wings get flayed.
That makes sense.
It is possible to capture them if you can, while they are sort of dormant, gather the shards into something that is kind of compact and doesn't allow them the space to potentially break through it. And if it's like a glass or ceramic or something like that, that can at least stand up to a little bit of thing, you can actually capture one and hold it safe. We don't know how intelligent they are. There's no indication that they have anything except instinct and sort of raw animal aggression in a sense. But they are fast and difficult to hurt. They've got a lot of actions and they do a lot of damage. They've also got the cursed luck ability, which we've talked about with other horrors and some constructs where they can mess with the dice rolls, turning the result on any individual die to a 1, reducing the results. Their attacks reduce the effectiveness of armor, and they feed on pain.
As all horrors do. The greater wing flare is super rare. Not as rare as the slip shades, but actually a little more rare than slip shades. Sorry. This one actually makes noises, tinkling and buzzing and grating and so forth and so on. All of them, however, just lay in wait.
Yeah. The sound is sort of the result of the various shards and slivers that make up their body rattling against each other and clattering and buzzing as they just kind of move around and whatnot. So it'd be a really kind of unsettling audio experience that you are going to have with that. And then, again, like with many of the greater versions of the things we've talked about, their numbers are just bigger and they're nastier. The greater wing flare has 5 actions per round.
Wow.
The standard wing flare has 4, which for a journeyman tier opponent is brutal.
Yeah.
And it could direct those, to any opponent sort of within its reach. It doesn't all have to go against the same individual.
Yeah, these work better when they have places to expand. Large rooms, large tunnels. As Josh said, give them a place where they are more compact and they're not as effective.
The greater wing flare has the ability where if they cause a wound, they can implant slivers. Then the next healing effect on the victim causes additional damage instead of healing them.
Yeah.
And if that healing effect has a duration, then it causes damage for the duration of the effect. And it can reduce the target's wound threshold as well, making it more likely that they are going to wound their target.
I mean, yeah, you've got large and small pieces of shrapnel, essentially, sharp shrapnel, flying at 35, 40, 50 mile an hour winds. Something's got to get embedded in you.
This is a wild, feral force of destruction.
Yeah. It's a food processor without the safety glass on the outside.
Yeah.
Just teasing. Okay. Our last one for this little set. This is our part 6 of the horrors, unnamed horrors. The Wormskull. And I know Josh has been kind of waiting for this one to come up. Is this, I'm just teasing.
Wormskulls are great. Yeah. Wormskulls are one of the iconic horror types in the game. Wormskull was the horror that was the antagonist of Inheritance, the short story that appeared in the original first edition book, the horror that Mestoff and Lorm and the dwarf thief who's narrating the story faced off against was a Wormskull. They can kind of vary in appearance, similar to the way that Bloatforms do, but for the most part, they all kind of share the similar fact that they are roughly humanoid in appearance, and their head, if not all of their limbs, are all composed of a mass of writhing worm things that form shapes to have kind of like gaps where the eyes or mouth would be. And then frequently they have these metallic plates in places on their body to resemble armor and whatnot. It is not uncommon for some of them to wear heavy obscuring cloaks in order to mask their appearance. They're wonderful. In the way that Bloatforms are kind of like the rawr, I'm a horror, aren't I awful and scary and disgusting, the Wormskulls are a lot more, I feel, suave and perhaps, for lack of a better term, like personable. They're still horrors and they're still evil, and they are going to try and manipulate you and get you to do nasty things and like causing fear and pain and disgust in their targets and feed off of that. But they're iconic in part because they have skin shift, which is a power that does a lot of damage and separates the victim's skin from the muscle beneath, twists everything around, and causes a lot of damage and causes wounds. You know, they've got a whole bunch of spell powers. They can animate dead. They are an iconic archetypal horror.
It was one of the first color plates I ever turned to in the original first edition core book that I said, okay, this is not your usual, this is not your usual game. Because if those are one of the bad guys, we're in for a treat. The other telltale sign about a Wormskull is that their presence removes moisture within about 1,000 yards around
typically
them. And so you can kind of feel parched and dry skin if you're approaching somewhere where they might actually be. But I think I have a pop culture example of a Wormskull.
Okay.
Oogie Boogie from The Nightmare Before Christmas, when his burlap sack comes off, reminds me
there is
of
kind of
Wormskull.
A Wormskull aspect of that. Yeah. That's not a bad image to conjure to mind there.
Woohoo! And then there's the Greater Wormskull.
And then there's the Greater Wormskull, which is like the Wormskull, but more.
Larger, 8 to 9 feet tall, with more worms, maggots, and bits of metal. And they have an entourage of constructs around, undead, and other horrors. Not just constructs.
The Greater Wormskull really is a kind of campaign-ending mastermind that might have been manipulating situations and having minions that are doing its bidding in other places and whatnot. Like the regular Wormskull, just more. Some of the powers that get introduced in the companion for these more powerful horrors are available to it. It's continued to got the skin shift and the spell abilities and the animate dead and stuff like that. These guys are just ultra.
Yeah, because they are highly intelligent. Most horrors are highly intelligent, the named ones especially, and all of them are technically cruel, but the Wormskulls are especially cruel. And the Wormskulls are also, by the way, patient. Most of the horrors we've covered, most of the horrors we're going to cover, are incredibly patient. They take their time. They lay plans.
Long-lived, ancient beings, the more powerful ones especially. Not a lot is known really about the horrors. Are the horrors like a whole bunch of different species? Are these just various life forms, like the way that we've got plants and animals and sapient beings in our world, that like these are alien things that come into our world from distant places and they are just different varieties and like the full diverse array of an alien biosphere? There is some indication in the story series Talisman, because all of that revolves around the same horror, that over time, horrors can become sort of more intelligent and more powerful and more cunning. And so the smarter ones have been around for a while and they understand the ability to be patient.
Yeah.
You know, they understand the need for that.
They're like a spider in the web, just waiting for you to...
Yeah, I mean, and if they can extend out the torment of a victim and to spread it out, that can be that much more of a feast for them.
Yeah.
If you're not going to deal with one of the named horrors that we're going to be talking about in the future, like one of those already created named horrors, you could very easily take a greater Wormskull and just make it a named horror of some sort.
Yeah.
Just in terms of like, okay, this is the way that it operates. This is the sort of thing that it does. I think the Wormskulls and the Bloatforms both conjure to me the creatures from the Hellraiser series.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense.
In terms of just being these kind of like weird alien entities that have desires and goals that are fundamentally unsettling to us.
Yeah.
But also by the same token could potentially be very charming and personable when it suits their purposes.
Mm-hmm.
They enjoy causing pain and suffering and inflicting that, but there is a certain amount of relationship that they like to perhaps develop with their victims, and it is in some ways perhaps even sweeter if their victims come to them
willingly.
Initially, willingly.
Yeah, because betrayal is also part of that feast.
Yes.
Because they're feeding on all those negative emotions you have. And so that's just a snack a day, essentially, is more feelings of betrayal.
The Wormskull, again, feeling like a kind of major epic enemy, depending on the power level of your game, whether you're going with the standard Wormskull or the greater, feels like similar to the undead Lich Lord in his lair situation, just in terms of the role that they would kind of serve in a story or adventure. Earthdawn does not have a lot of the powerful undead that you run into in other fantasy games. You don't have your vampires, you don't have your specters so much, you don't have your ancient, ageless, undead wizards with a lot of power. That role is filled by powerful horrors, with that level of actual horror, as in the genre, going along with it, and a real sense of evil that is not necessarily always the case with some of the other stuff.
Absolutely. So if those don't wet your whistle, we will be getting into the named horrors further on in other episodes coming up soon.
One last thing that I want to mention, since we do have a little bit of time left here. In response to our last episode where we were talking about horrors, it was mentioned in, actually by Lou in a post on the Facebook Earthdawn Guild group, about how there are some horrors that you might need to be careful with. It is very easy, perhaps in some respects, to inflict them on your players without them being aware, and putting them into a situation where, you went and drank from this stream and now you're all, you all swallowed a bunch of dread iota. And I think one of the things that you need to do, first off, is make sure that everybody is on the same page in terms of their desires to have such things inflicted on their characters, and perhaps the loss of agency or player character control that could go along with that. And go back to the episode that we did with Rev, where we were talking about safety tools and things like that. These are topics that need to be covered in a session 0 to make sure that everybody kind of understands what's going on and is part of the ongoing conversation. Depending on how you want to approach it, what type of horror are you going to be doing? And I don't mean that in terms of like what type of horror creature, but in terms of the style or genre. We talked about the Slipshade being a kind of
ghost that goes bump in the night.
Slasher ghost that goes bump in the night, haunting a place, and how you can have that be a mood or style, and how much of that is going to be directly personal assault on the player characters, and how much of it is going to be them discovering a problem that is affecting a place or other people and then needing to investigate and deal with it. And I would like to recommend to folks that if you are interested in that sort of thing, Monster of the Week, the Powered by the Apocalypse game that I am a fan of, has some really, really good advice in it for structuring the kind of monster hunter mystery thing where you have the problem, like the monster in this case would be like a horror. Well, what is its methods? How does it operate? What is it doing?
Motives.
Does it have minions, innocence and motives and all that sort of thing? And provides a really nice template that is easily adaptable to any other system in terms of structuring an adventure that allows you to have your characters go up against that in a kind of heroic, supernatural, or action horror, or even more traditional horror kind of situation, and a way of structuring that so that you are not completely removing the agency of the characters in terms of what they might want to do or how they might go about investigating it. The GM advice in Monster of the Week in terms of how to structure your mysteries, as they're called in there, would be really, really good advice to look at in terms of structuring adventures or longer campaign arcs that you might have revolving around a horror, especially more cunning ones. And I think if you're going to have some of the ones that are a bit more like ambush style, like Dread Iotas or Mind Slugs or things like that, that you, as part of the setup for the situation, provide some clues or hints about what might be going on so that the group would have the opportunity to take action to prevent themselves from becoming unnecessarily and unfairly affected by it. You know, this is a case where a Nethermancer will typically take horror lore or something like that as one of their knowledge skills, or even if you want to have them do it as a half magic test, perhaps with a slightly higher difficulty number, in order to pick up on clues or have information that might come to hand in terms of dealing with those sorts of things. I think especially with some of the ones that are easy to inflict on players unawares, like the Dread Iota, kind of keep coming back to that one, because if you don't know to look for it, it is very easy in some ways to just completely get destroyed by it without you even really necessarily knowing what's going on. Having it be more of a situation where the group comes into a location that is being affected in some way by horrors, whether they get drawn there by a message that is sent by a friend or ally, whether it's something that they just kind of come across in the course of their regular travels and need to investigate and find out what's going on and figure out how to deal with it, with the risk of becoming infected or corrupted by it, a looming threat there, but have it be something where they are coming in and knowing that that is the case. Astral sensing would indicate that there is a higher, a greater level of corruption. So they might know to be aware of this kind of dangerous potential threat going on. Being able to look at the victims that might already be there and what has happened to them and why that might be going on. Having a survivor or two who is perhaps mentally or psychologically broken in some way, that they can't provide ready answers, but maybe have some hints about what's going on. Maybe the way that they're behaving allows them to escape the worst of what's going on. Think of like Newt from Aliens, the second film, or the young girl who survived in the tunnels and whatnot. Another similar game, it's sci-fi rather than fantasy, but is also very kind of like horror oriented along those lines, is Starhold, is another one to look at. And looking perhaps as well at the kind of pop culture variant version of Call of Cthulhu Adventures, where you've got the investigators who are delving into weird things and then encounter dangerous monsters or whatever. There's a slightly different approach that you have with a game like that, but all of those can be really handy in terms of offering advice on how to structure your stories and adventures and encounters with some of these more insidious opponents so that the players don't feel ambushed and treated unfairly if things don't necessarily go the best for them.
Mm-hmm.
Another part of that, which ties into safety tools in session 0 and whatnot, is what kind of tone are you going for in your game? Are you really going to be going for a kind of dark, horror-tinted, paranoid type of game? Or is it going to be more sort of a heroic fantasy? It's going to be dangerous, and there are going to be body horror or gore or psychological horror aspects of it, but it's ultimately going to be kind of a heroic swords and sorcery thing where the player characters are not going to necessarily be the direct targets of such things frequently, like an almost kind of superhero situation where they are coming in to save the day where one of these entities is causing problems for a mundane and normal community.
Agreed. It's you have to, like, figuring out there's a horror behind all this is also a mystery. You have to have clues along the way before you get to the big reveal at the end of the mystery. And so it shouldn't be as straightforward as snatch and grab or something along those lines. If you're going to incorporate a horror, you have to drop some clues to get the player characters to understand what they are up to, Josh's point, to prepare themselves in the long run.
Yeah. If you go back and listen to the one shot that's in the feed here that I put up a couple of years ago that I ran for the folks at the Crit Show, where they descend into these tunnels and initially find there's this dead body of something that definitely appears to be some kind of horror or horror construct creature. And it's weird, and we're a little unsettled, and there's some uncomfortable sensations that come about as a result of that. And then they find the care and deal with the inhabitants there, and things seem a little bit normal, but like gradually get off and weird, and then things get ramped up and the tension gets ramped up. And then like they find there's this horror plant thing with tentacle vines and whatnot that is controlling this community and having people get sacrificed to it. And again, there was not a lot of direct psychological or warping attacks on the characters. There's just a lot of really messed up stuff, and they need to cut to the heart of it and slay the beast. And that is a perfectly valid way of approaching it, that the horror from the situation comes from the variance from the norm, the way that things maybe seem a little bit slightly off, where I had these large cave beetles that had this kind of fungal growth on their heads. Oh, well, this particular explanation was given, but they're actually sort of servants of the horror.
Exactly. So I think that is a nice encapsulation of how to use any of the horrors we've talked about so far, and probably some of the upcoming named horrors we're going to get to in future episodes. So if you have any questions for us about how to use them or how you have used them, again, we'd like to hear the tales. Drop us a line at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, go be the greater version, not the regular version, of your legend.
Good night, everybody.